Very cool.
All right, so what's on the menu for today?
Well, sent over a little suggestion by email, which is this. It's something that I've been thinking about since our last conversation, which is these disruptions. Although the ones that we've been talking about and some of the historical ones have had some element of inevitability to them. My I guess it's an open question as to whether or not these disruptions can be resisted, delayed, prevented, that sort of thing, or whether they are sort of truly inevitable in some deeper sense. And so I thought the one thing that we could sort of ponder together is this question of what resistance to disruption looks like. Have there been any instances in the past that we can think of that maybe we could chat about, and what would it look like today or in particular for the three disruptions that my team is watching closely: the energy, transportation, and food, but also the others that are sort of in the offing right now. Potentially the disruption of human labor by machine labor and via automation and narrow artificial intelligence, and perhaps other disruptions that are not at the same sort of broad sector level, but perhaps within individual industries or some small unit of analysis like that. We could think, well, what does resisting or trying to derail disruption look like? And just to kind of kick things off, there are, I think, a few different lenses we could look at this through. What does it look like if you're looking at that from the perspective of an incumbent industry? What does that look like if you are a policymaker or a government, for example, and you're interested in, for whatever reason, slowing things down or resisting or preventing these disruptions from occurring? Say, for example, you have an economy that is very dependent upon one of the incumbent industries that's likely to be affected by the disruption. And so it's not in your nation's interest or your government's interest necessarily to have that industry disrupted. One that we talk about quite often is Russia, and what happens when natural gas, oil and coal, the fossil fuels are really, when demand for them plummets, Russia is in trouble. Russia's economy is not totally dependent, obviously, but has some dependence upon sale of fossil fuels to other countries. And so if that demand were to dry up, Russia would face a difficult situation. And there could be ramifications for that, geopolitical and otherwise. So one could imagine a country like Russia, a government like Russia's current government, being interested in taking some action to resist these disruptions, to delay them, to postpone them, and so forth. And so this topic kind of comes on the tails of the last week's discussion, and we were talking about countries that have sort of had the opposite approach, and China being the key example, which seems to, for the moment, to be very focused on accelerating these disruptions and emerging as a first mover and a leader. And of course, there's some pretty clear logic to what the advantages of doing so might be, certainly at a national level. So it probably comes as no surprise, and I would place a large personal bet that they're going to be successful and come out leading in all three of these areas: transportation, energy, and food. But I could be wrong. But if you asked me to gaze into a crystal ball in 2035 and see which nation was furthest along in all of this and leading, my money would be on China. But there is the other end of the spectrum as well, and so that's maybe something to talk about too. So anyway, that's my proposal for what we might talk about today, if that sounds okay.
Sounds good. How do you think about I guess several examples come to mind of not derailing disruption exactly, but kind of the mechanism, the market mechanisms of disruption that we've discussed are often quite dangerous to local economies, right? To take China as an example, China famously prevented tech companies from the West from establishing a foothold in major parts of the internet ecosystem there in order to shield and make room for its domestic competitors. That's kind of a derailing a disruption in a way. There would have been local industries take local newspapers, I guess, for example, that probably had their disruption timetable delayed by that activity to some extent. So that's an example in a sense of not, it's sort of postponing a disruption or taking charge of a disruption or something. But the mechanism used to slow it down seems to be kind of applicable to stopping it also.
It sounds like a broader mechanism because there's always like regulations that kind of try and put the brakes on certain disruptions. And sometimes tech startups, for example, seem to open up in a space where there isn't much regulation, but when they are up against a place where there is regulation, I think the regulation can act kind of like a bottleneck.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, we've been looking at examples of disruption that are market driven and where market forces are, and when I say market forces, I mean that in sort of the narrow sense of there's some competitive environment where there are multiple sources of demand, multiple sources of supply, and some sort of competitive a sort of zero-sum kind of dynamic where it's in the interest of one agent to outperform another agent, and you get dynamics emerging from that. But we do see examples. In fact, my team was talking about this earlier this week. We do see examples where we have technology disruptions that are driven primarily by governments, and governments either are providing the sole source of demand, or they're providing the sole source of the supply, or both. And so the example we were thinking through was the development of nuclear weapons, for example. So that occurred, at the tail end, starting at the tail end of World War II, of course, but 15 years later, and this keeps coming up, this sort of 15-year time frame. 15 years later, the United States had 20,000 nuclear weapons in the early 1960s. 15 years after the end of World War II, but that was not market-driven per se, right? But that was an extremely disruptive technology for warfare. It completely changed everything about warfare for the nuclear-powered country. So so it may be too narrow of a lens to think of this just in terms of markets, because there are other historical examples of forces besides just market forces that can drive disruption, and we see the same dynamic. So it was an S curve in the with the build out of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, for example, and the Soviet arsenal as well, a longer S curve, about twice as long, about 30 years from the Soviet Union. The same dynamics seem to apply, despite the origin of those forces being quite different. So it may be that with resistance, if it's through non-market mechanisms, maybe those would be could be very powerful forces, because we've seen those forces drive the disruption. So we may well expect those sorts of forces could stop or certainly slow down tremendously, in some cases, a potential disruption. So that makes some sense.
Another force that comes to mind is public opinion. So I was trying to look in Stuart Russell's book Human Compatible because I thought this was where he discussed it, but I might have heard him talk about it on a podcast or something, or maybe it was someone else. Two examples. One of them, rather than nuclear weapons, nuclear power, and the other one is GMO food production. If I'm not mistaken, Stuart Russell or someone like that was explaining these in relation to like AI development and kind of predicting the future of that. I think he was saying with nuclear power and GMOs, there are like all these advantages. These would be disruptive technologies, except people are kind of putting a chokehold on them because they're worried about the negative consequences. And so development is kind of stifled in these areas. And he was talking about it because he was saying, maybe we should avoid this happening to AI through being careless and having AI systems cause harm that people take notice of, and then public opinion turns against AI, and we don't eventually get to the great benefits that could come from AI. So yeah, GMOs and nuclear power, two examples that I think public opinion is against.
Yeah, those are great examples. Those are fantastic examples. GMOs in particular. So with nuclear power, the potential for disruption nuclear power doesn't meet all of my team's internal criteria for disruption as a technology. The main one being it never proved to be cost competitive. I mean, in the early days, it was competing with fossil fuels that were very cheap. Fossil fuels have sort of become a little bit more expensive in some respects. The price of everything has changed in 70 years, so that the direct comparisons are harder to make, not completely straightforward. But at any rate, the original thinking was that nuclear power would be, the proverbial expression was too cheap to meter, and that was not borne out, unfortunately. And one of our criteria, my team's internal criteria for a technology disruption, is that the new entrant, technology, or multiple technologies that converge into providing some competitive service, for example. So like solar plus batteries, not solar alone. It has to be cost competitive. It has to be, in order for a full disruption to occur, it has to be almost overwhelmingly cost competitive. And we don't have sort of a threshold. We see disruptions driven by new technologies that are half the price and some that are a tenth of the price, but very few that are only like 50% cheaper. It tends to need to be a bigger margin than that. So nuclear power is maybe it doesn't quite fit all of the criteria, although maybe potentially. I mean, if it hadn't had some of the public resistance that were sort of like fallout, no pun intended. Well, I guess it's a good pun, but pun intended, the fallout from the nuclear disasters that then dissuaded the public from having proper investment advance the technology further. GMOs though seems fairly unequivocal. I mean, they at least some species are well over twice as half as expensive, twice as cheap, and they're much better in many respects than non-GMO crops, and not just crops. I mean, you have GMO fish and other organisms. But I think GMOs is a superb example because in most ways, you have to take it on a product by product basis. But the technology certainly, if you look at a species by species, case by case basis, you can certainly see examples where the GMO product is just superior in every respect, especially cost to the non-GMO alternative. And yet, we have GMO foods are effectively banned in Europe, and that really has prevented that disruption from that particular technology. This is a very, very good example.
You said every respect, but I guess that's maybe quite a narrow. Like you're talking about the technical kind of efficiency aspects and everything. The one aspect in which is obviously not competitive is in public opinion.
Yes, you're right. Of course, you're right. Of course, I would. Yes, exactly. Quite so. The metrics I was thinking of are the ones that my team typically would imagine. So these would be cost, performance as. So if you were if you were evaluating the criteria that are on that are these products are marketed under, for example, so with food products, it would be taste, nutritional content, and that sort of thing. On the production side with food, it would be things like water intensity and pesticide and herbicide intensity and that kind of thing. There are GMOs that just outperform in virtually all of those dimensions. So but you're right, of course, it doesn't, none of that means anything if the public's not willing to buy it because of concerns. And in GMOs, some of those concerns are warranted, and many of them are not warranted. Many of them are quite irrational concerns, irrational fears about risks that are not really legitimately evidenced.
Yeah, I think the GMO one is a good example because it illustrates, I think, what is maybe a sort of generic mechanism of derailing disruption. So a disruption is a kind of exponential phenomenon, right? And we know from fighting viruses and so on that typically if you want to fight an exponential, you need another exponential of some kind. A good exponential is kind of a meme or a piece of culture that spreads. With GMOs, that's clearly the case, right? So you might have exponentials on one side, decreasing cost, increasing yield, but the competitive force is also exponential. It's the spread of the idea that GMOs will turn you into a soybean or whatever, and that acts the kind of I put a cartoon on the board that illustrates the phase transition that's happening when one local minima is lower than another, right? So on the left-hand side, there's the blue local minima, which is the configuration, the technology, whatever, which by some means has become the preferred global minimum, and then everybody's shifting to it. But by some act, you can increase the energy or sort of make that potential well less deep, and then you stop the disruption if you can at least keep it at the same level or higher than the old equilibrium. So there's sort of two factors there, right? I mean, you have to somehow engineer that, you have to change that potential, and that's a distributed thing. It's in the heads of the people, at least in the market example, that's in the heads of the people that are making the individual choices to switch. So it does seem that culture must have a pretty fundamental role in derailing disruptions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. I think it's a very, very powerful way of thinking about it. And I wonder if you have, so you have this interface at sort of the scale at which these, what am I trying to say here? So you have individuals who are consumers, and they are a source of demand, and they exert some sort of force or influence over the quantity of demand for X, or for whatever it is. Let's say it's GMO salmon or something like that. And then at a different level, you have sort of government, which is able to step in and intervene in the markets in a variety of different ways. I mean, governments can decide to subsidize something. So we're talking about resisting the disruption. Government could do that by subsidizing older technology, bailing out. Bailouts are one thing that we're quite concerned about for the old energy industry, and for the old auto industry, for example. We're kind of expecting that some bailouts of some sort will occur. So that would be a government intervention that would prop up the incumbency for a time. You could go further than that, of course, as in the case of GMOs, and have government just create an outright ban. So they just bring the hammer down on and drop demand right down to zero. And so you could imagine some sort of threshold where if public opinion turns enough that it can be instituted, in and reflected in regulation, and in the extreme case, in an outright ban, then you could cut off the exponential growth of demand for that new technology completely. And so I think this is a very, very interesting way to think about that.
What's the diagram that Tony draws with these? I mean, you're referring here to one of the mechanisms in that schema for disruption, right? Where the increasing demand for the new technology decreases demand for the old one. And it's kind of the disruption always, in a sense, has two sides, right? It's two interacting processes. Yes. So the government intervention, you see that as happening primarily by propping up the new thing. I mean, I guess you can tax the new thing, but a tax, if it's linear, can't really, it might slow down a disruption, but it's like, at least at a theoretical level, unless the tax is like a ban, seems like it can only delay it. Or, of course, these things are complicated, but at some abstract level, maybe a tax, you wouldn't expect it to stop a disruption. I don't know. What do you think?
I agree. I think that this is it's unlikely that that taxes or penalties or so a tax or a tax or other penalties, cost of doing business, anything that makes the new technology more expensive than it ought to be, would be a way of protecting the incumbency. And on the flip side of that, anything that sort of subsidizes the incumbency, those things, one could probably expect that they would only slow down disruption as opposed to halting it completely. Now, you can always imagine edge cases where that's not true, where a technology might be, its potential might be just enough such that it could be disruptive, but it's not. So here, I'm just going to make up some numbers just for purposes of illustration. But let's say a technology had the potential in after scaling to approach a cost that was half of that of the incumbent technology, the older technology, and everything else is equal. So there's no other potential differences for public opinion, or there are differences in environmental externalities or anything like that. It's basically just the same technology, new process, but you've got maybe this thing is twice or half the price, right? And then you come along and you subsidize the incumbent technology. How much do you have to subsidize it before you pass some threshold where it's just the new technology is no longer cheap enough, less expensive enough than the older one for a disruption to really take hold and happen? And one could imagine, that you could tip over that threshold with subsidies or other market interventions that were not outright bans, but that had the effect of achieving something similar. You could imagine a scenario like that. Now, I can't think of any real world scenarios where that's been the case, but one could imagine that those sorts of things are possible.
I have a question. So
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. But what I was going to say, you could imagine if for some reason some government had, in the 1970s and 80s had decided that it wanted to subsidize VHS tapes, tape cassette recorders, even though Betamax was basically a better technology. At least my understanding is it was slightly better technology. But the difference was fairly small between the two. It wasn't like Betamax was 10 times better or something like that. One could imagine. Anyway, you could imagine a scenario where the two technologies are competing. They're cheap. They're comparable enough or similar enough that it wouldn't take very much, to forestall the one disrupting the other. So I think we can imagine scenarios like that where that might be the case. Yeah.
You were going to say something, Matt?
Yeah, I think there might be a problem with the exponential versus exponential conceptual idea, because it just seems like when you have this kind of feedback loop, a small change in the constant, like the multiplicative constant, surely that can make a difference when you then amplify it through a feedback loop. So, for example, some of those cycles are like people piling onto development and research in the new technology. And that could be affected by how hard it is to kind of get a cultural movement or like an industry movement going around a new technology. So there's an exponential element coming in from the cultural aspect. Also, I'm not sure if it's formally exponential. I'm just kind of thinking quite vaguely here.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Well, why don't we expand on that, and if you guys don't mind, can we sort of dig in there in the context of the diagram that Dan has drawn on the right-hand side, and we do have a more elaborate version of exactly what Dan has drawn here that has a few more loops in it, that includes things like network effects that emerge around platforms. So whatever becomes popular first gets a network of users, and then that becomes a feedback loop. You have things like infrastructure. So if the technology requires a supporting infrastructure, and that ball gets rolling, then that forms a feedback loop. You've got sort of the social sanction and public opinion that forms feedback loops on both sides of on both sides. So you can have public opinion swell for the new technology, or you could have it swell against the new technology, or you could have it swell against the old technology, and you have effectively a loss of social license for the old technology, as we're now seeing with fossil fuels to some extent. So we've got, and then you have government support, direct and indirect, subsidies, taxes, regulatory strictures and standards that must be achieved, and so forth. So you've got all these pieces, and perhaps the clearest way that you could, if you were in a business or an industry, or if you were a country that were threatened by disruption, you could imagine that your best silver bullet would be something like an outright ban on the new technology. Okay, ban GMOs. Okay, problem solved. As long as your government can maintain that regulation. But short of that, are there any other places in there that would be extremely high leverage points, as Matt was pointing out, where you could effectively halt one of these feedback loops and really derail things a bit, and that's what I'm hoping to spot here. And before let me add one more thought to that. I'm particularly interested in understanding this because one of my bosses, Jamie, is his project right now is he's writing a piece which he is calling the Incumbents Playbook, which is it's sort of the idea is to point out all of the ways in which incumbents have responded in the past in their attempts to resist disruptions, and what we should expect going forward, so that we can be, forewarned is forearmed, right? So that we can, share that insight, and policymakers, decision makers, investors can sort of see these tactics coming in advance rather than be surprised by them. So I actually have an agenda, as I always do. Sorry to be selfish here, but for why I'm interested in picking your brains on this topic. My boss is actually working on this, and if we could identify, something other than just these outright bans that could be very effective ways to resist disruption, that would be a very, very valuable insight.
What were the other things on this list before social sanction? I didn't get a chance to write them down. That appear in this diagram that we haven't drawn.
So other things are investment in infrastructure. You have network effects and the emergence of leading platforms and standards. Trying to think what else there are. I mean, the other things are mostly to do with costs, scaling, expansion of supply because of attraction of investment. Yeah, those are the other pieces. That, a government, just general, subsidies, or so you have social sanction, and then you basically have government sanction slash regulatory support, or or whatever the opposite of support is, barriers or encumbrance or something like that.
I wonder where on this diagram would fit the following strategy. So if I was going to prevent disruption without it seeming like I was doing that, what I would do is I would, through regulation that only big companies can follow, and by changing like workplace regulation, doubling the amount of paperwork you need to do around any activity with human resources or whatever, I would favor a duopoly or a monopoly in whatever area it was, and just rely on the fact that large companies are sclerotic and stupid and won't actually try anything new. And if they swallow up all the resources, then, and the talent, I mean, I guess that's the other major thing, right? It's also a factor of, I mean, maybe SpaceX could have been built 40 years ago. It's not that we didn't have the metal or the resources or the technology. It's just that there was no way of coordinating the people to put them in one place and give them the capital to do it. And the reason for that was that all the people and capital had been swallowed up by large, dumb corporations. So you could almost say that NASA and the US government conspired to derail the disruption that we now see in the space industry. And they succeeded, right? For, 50 years.
That's fantastic. I absolutely love that. Let me write that down. Right here.
So yeah, I guess talent is kind of the other ingredient here in disruption that maybe isn't so prominent in your modeling, right? Where do you see that in the disruption cycle? I mean, I guess you tend to think of the technology as sort of, do you see a disruption as starting when the technology is in some sense worked out and it's just a matter of getting it to scale and deploying it and finding its market and refining it? Or is... I'm not sure.
It's a very good question. I mean, if it weren't for Tesla and the examples of Tesla and SpaceX, my answer would in the past have been that the talent seems to be something that's front-ended a lot in the research and development, and then disruptions really, the disruption portion of a technology life cycle is something in the from like 5 or 10% of market to 80 to 90% of market. That's when the disruption happens for practical purposes, and the lead up to that is where you have research and development. And if you'd asked me in the past, where do you really need brains? Where do you really need great people? Where do you really need good engineers and so forth? I would say, well, in the R&D phase, and then in the deployment and scaling phase, which is when the disruption really blows up. Well, then you've done most of the hard work, and most deployment and scaling is a matter of economies of scale, manufacturing efficiencies, logistics, that sort of thing. The improvements are incremental from that point on, and you don't need the absolute best of the best of the best, brilliant minds working on that piece. You've already solved the hard thing. So that would have been my intuition, but I don't know if we're seeing that now. I mean, Tesla and SpaceX seem to have this enormous advantage over their competitors by virtue of the fact that they have a cult of attraction to the world's brightest, or some of the world's certainly brightest engineering and scientific minds. There's no question that they're still tapping into an incredible resource there that's fueling all of their explosive growth and success. And so, maybe it's just dumb to think that you don't need really smart people all the way through until you really are approaching the end of the disruption and saturation at whatever level
Yeah,
you're
I would.
advocating towards. I mean, I don't know. It seems like a strange situation.
That seems a bit like too valuing too highly the scientists in that story. I mean, I think that the history of the Industrial Revolution, for example, seems. I mean, Watt didn't invent the steam engine, right? He made many advances of a not fundamental nature, but like in trying to bring it to scale and actually be able to build things at the manufacturing tolerances of the time. And that's clearly where SpaceX. I mean, I don't know the history of like self-guided rocketry and returning to the launch pad or whatever, but if I dug into it, I would be pretty sure I would find that 20 years before SpaceX did it, it was more or less well understood. The main challenge is just manufacturing devices that do it one after another, and not doing it as a one-off kind of thing. So it seems like there's, I guess Elon Musk likes to say this, right? That building one thing is easy and building 1,000 of them is the hard part. I do think that that's an important part of disruption, right? That figuring out like the underlying science is not necessarily the hard part.
One other possibility here is that disruptions earlier in human history were more dependent upon sort of fundamental breakthroughs and insights, just a new way of thinking or doing something at a quite a basic level, compared to today, where in order for a technology to be disruptive by the criteria that we've talked about, it has to, in order for it to be that much better, it has to be in some sense more sophisticated / complicated or something, and it is simply more difficult today to do the deployment and scaling. I mean, if you had the fundamental insight 400 years ago to change some process on a farm, for example, or something like that, maybe it was just the insight that really mattered, and then that insight could spread like a contagion, and anybody could pick it up and put it into practice. Whereas maybe today it's just more difficult to make advances like that. There's no more perhaps low-hanging fruit in that sense, and so it's not possible for disruptions to occur independently from massive brain power and talent involved in a way that they perhaps could have in centuries past. And so part of that may be just there's some way in which technology itself is the character and nature of it is now shifting and making that you see what I mean. I'm blathering a bit, but yeah.
I think that's right. I was thinking a bit about your question the other day about what are the ultimate limits to disruption or whatever, and I do think the complexity of our social coordination technologies is the obvious one, right? So I would say that actually we're witnessing an era of relative stagnation in science for precisely this reason. I mean, we perceive it in moral terms, like we say there's a replication crisis because people are lazy and corrupt and they cheat to advance their careers, etc., etc. But we tend to overlay too much moral interpretation on things. It's simpler just to say that the mechanisms we came up with for wide-scale distributed progress in science, like peer review, etc., which are kind of social coordination technologies, just have a limit, and we're at it, and we don't perceive it really because we don't see outside of our little bubble. But from the point of view of the future, maybe there's a next thing, science version 2.0, which has a different set of institutions and communication mechanisms and norms and culture. And in 50 years we'll be there and we'll think it's very normal, and we'll see that actually you can do a lot more with that and go further. But I do think that's an under-invested in area of technology which feeds into everything else, right? And maybe, that's the kind of flip side of my comment about earlier about capturing the talent and wasting it, right? If the only social coordination mechanisms you have effectively max out at a certain number of people, and if you put more resources in them, they just waste it, then in a sense, you could do that deliberately in order to derail a disruption, but you could also say that there's like 1 million latent disruptions sitting there right now that are in a sense permanently derailed until we get our act together and figure out, how not to have everything be made up of monopolies and duopolies and wasting talent left, right, and center.
Yeah, I think you could even look at this from the other. You can sort of flip it around and look at it from another perspective, which is that societies that, for whatever reason, not whatever reason, but for various different reasons, chose to foster both the talent in their citizenry, to cultivate that, and then to celebrate innovation and entrepreneurial success and enterprising these things. The cultures that adopted or developed those values, we've seen a lot of disruptions out of those cultures emerge out of those cultures, right? And so you can kind of look at talent as a deeper phenomenon like that, and in societies where that sort of thinking and the cultivation of literacy and an educated citizenry and the cultivation of this sort of heroic mythos around being enterprising and entrepreneurial, which the United States has typified for a long time, for example, and other countries, of course, as well. Maybe that's sort of a way that you accelerate disruption or technological advance across the board, and of course that encompasses whatever disruptions that occur. And of course, to the extent that you don't do that, if you do the opposite of that, if you limit the development of your citizenry's potential, and then you don't celebrate or honor or reward innovation and entrepreneurialism and so forth, then and have mechanisms, a variety of different institutions to support those things, then you're not going to get technological advance in the same sort of way. And you can see that at the broadest scale, entire society, or you probably, as we're talking, you can sort of see that within the subcultures of particular industries or sectors of the economy, or or narrower. And so I think it's super, super keen insight. And then I think the other thing you said, Dan, is very, very important, which is the social, the social coordination now it's almost certainly a limiting factor, right? Even though a lot of that coordination is being amplified by very powerful information technology tools. I think we take for granted how we are sort of all juiced on the steroids of social steroids of information technologies in terms of how we can coordinate, communicate, and plan together. We take it all for granted, but we can do so much more today than was possible 2 or 3 generations ago. Worldwide, globally, especially. So that absolutely has to be a limiting factor. Actually, sorry guys, hang on. You guys carry on. I think I hear my young daughter out of bed wandering around upstairs.
Sure.
I'm like, maybe another one then.
Stole this culture of subtweeting or subboarding from you, Matt. You like to write on the boards behind people. This is such a good idea.
Do I?
I noticed you doing it. I hadn't thought of doing it somehow. I don't know. I never, if a speaker's up there, I sort of never would have thought of writing on the board, but you were providing some notes for, maybe it was Adam one day, and then that occurred to me that if it's done well, quite a generous activity somehow, right?
Oh yeah, I remember that. I've been to a presentation where it was like a panel talk, and they had an illustrator who was on the screen share sketching. She was just sketching like the panelists, and then like a mind map, like a concept map of what they were talking about as they were talking about it.
That's such a cool
kind of like
idea.
what you're doing.
Yeah.
But she was like a professional illustrator and doing it with the cool cartoons and everything. Not that your cartoons aren't cool, Dan.
That's all right. Yeah, that's definitely a job. That's a cool idea. What were you saying, Adam? Oh, he's still gone.
Okay, sorry guys, thanks for being patient.
Yeah, no problem.
What did I miss?
Oh, we were just discussing the future job of being a live cartoonist for meetings in the metaverse. When people are talking, you can actually do good cartoons behind their heads to illustrate what they're talking about. That's neat. Yeah, what's the general role of communication in these feedback loops? I mean, it's involved in every step in some sense, but I mean, this is an old cybernetics idea, right? Control and communication. But one way to derail a disruption is to, if you think about the communication which affects control in a disruption as kind of being the information about the new product or the lower price, or the information which tells producers that a new technology is available to be adopted, there's definitely a role for, I mean, even just like making advertising less effective probably slows down a disruption, right? And maybe that's one place if you wanted to derail disruption. You can tell people that solar panels are for commies or something, which is a kind of manipulation of the culture, but you could also just, I don't know, if you have a fossil fuel company, just buy up all the AdWords for solar panels and replace them by links to llama farms or something.
Yeah, I was going to say that if you're talking about the ways that public opinion and also government can kind of influence these processes, these are not the only levers of power in society. There's also obviously the media, as in the group of mediums through which information flows. And that's to tie it back to this idea of communication. And so I think in general, media is like a powerful, influential lever on public opinion and other things in society. But if you, for example, systematically, like Dan was suggesting some specific strategies, but then imagine how you're not going to see ads for an alternative social network on Facebook.
Right.
Anyone who has this kind of control over media platform is, or whatever media platform people are using to see their to get their information, you're going to be able to kind of filter it in a way that could completely prevent communication about new technology or distort it or whatever.
What about co-opting disruption? I mean, I'm thinking about the way that the Catholic Church responded to the Reformation, which was very successful, right? I mean, well, very bloody and took a long time.
Can you summarize that?
Okay, so many churches, I mean, many Protestant churches and others split off after the Bible was published in native languages, and the Catholic Church was sort of under siege for a long time and felt its authority eroded, and it was eroded sort of permanently, but many at the time foresaw that the Catholic Church would become basically nothing and reduced to a rump of its former self, and that the Anglican Church would be all powerful in England, and then there would be other Protestant churches in Germany and elsewhere, and Lutherans and all the rest. But the Catholic Church really managed to subvert a lot of those processes and reassert control. Largely, I think, because they had a lot of talent. But you could say, I mean, I wouldn't say that they succeeded in derailing the disruption, but they certainly co-opted many of the trends that made people switch to other religions, which were, I mean, for example, they actually, to some extent, tackled corruption in the Catholic Church, which was mainly what Luther was complaining about. There was, I forget the name, there was a major meeting so late, I can't remember the name. It's a famous convocation or something where they discussed what to do in reaction to the Reformation, and I mean, they didn't do very much, so they could have. It's a bit like celebrities now refusing to apologize in front of cancel culture. The Catholic Church basically decided to opt against apologizing and changing and stuck to its guns to some extent, and it worked. So you could, I mean, maybe there's cases where you can't really co-opt a disruption, like with fossil fuels versus, well, okay, take BP, for example. Certainly in their marketing, they're attempting such a co-option. Can you think of any successful examples of co-opting a disruption, Adam?
I was just going to suggest that to the extent that they co-opt the disruption and go along with the disruption, and the disruption still kind of happens, they're just the one in charge of it, then they haven't really prevented the disruption,
right?
Even if they maintain their control. But maybe that's not what you're talking about. So I was a little confused by the story, whether or not, in the end, corruption was reduced or not. And I'm not sure about BP. I haven't seen the advertising. But for example, if BP became a promoter and developer of renewable energy, that would seem like the disruption going forward. In this case, that would be a good thing because of the kind of normative context of this particular disruption.
Well, those are two distinct phenomena. The latter one, Matt, the one that you are describing, is that was really the focus of Clayton Christensen's work on and where the word disruption came from in a sort of a business sense, not so much a technological sense, but in a business sense. And what you're talking about is what he termed self-disruption, and he showed with pretty good work, good theoretical work, and good empirical work, that businesses really have a whole bunch of forces and incentives aligned against them as far as self-disruption goes, and so incumbents it's very difficult for them to align the incentives so that they can be self-disruptive, and we're sort of seeing that play out right now in the auto industry, the legacy auto industry. Detroit's big three, automakers, and then the German car companies and the Japanese car companies. They are struggling to reinvent themselves in knowing that this electric vehicle and autonomous driving revolution is coming. They know that the disruption is coming. There are no illusions really inside among the executives. There are a few holdouts, but most of these companies see the writing on the wall. They just don't know how to execute a self-disruption that allows them to survive. There are a lot of things that they're working against that. So that's one particular phenomenon, and that is, and I think that's maybe one type. I don't know if it's completely separate from, but perhaps it's one type of co-opting the dynamics of a disruption. The other kind would be what I think Dan is talking about, which is maybe not so much something we might see in industry, but that we might see in other flavors of disruption. So social ones of governance, ones of in other institutions like religions, like Dan mentioned. And in that sense, you could imagine, for example, that you could even imagine the content of disruption standing somewhat separate or free from the just the fact of disruption itself. So let me give you an example. You could imagine that in order to sort of keep pace with the times, an old institution would need to reinvent itself, but it may be enough just to reinvent itself in some way, not in some particular way. In other words, it might not, it may have been enough for the Catholic Church to just rebrand itself as something new and different, not necessarily rebrand itself as precisely what was specified in ahead of time in by the forces that anticipated and fueled the a disruption of some kind. And so I guess I'm kind of being a bit vague here. There are concrete examples. What other concrete examples might there be? So maybe analogy is a good thing to think about here. Maybe if you're at some sort of crisis and circumstances change around you, you have to adapt, you have to change or perish. And that you could think of it by analogy as sort of like a speciation event. And sort of ecologically or biologically, you might be in some situation in which your old adaptiveness fails because conditions have changed. And there may be multiple new ways to emerge successfully, some new set of adaptations, some new model that would work. Might be more than one of those, but none of the old ones would work. And so you could imagine that being some kind of situation in which an incumbent transforms and reinvents itself, but doesn't necessarily do it in exactly or a single way. We might be able to think
that makes sense.
Instead of switching back from analogy to something more literal, we might be able to look at examples of are there companies that completely reinvented themselves because they just because of a disruption, and they came out of it not as the disruptors, and not companies that self-disrupted and then became whatever the leaders in whatever the new technology was, but just pivoted to something completely different and then continued to be successful. I bet we could find examples of that. Dan, does that align at all with what you were thinking in terms of co-optation?
I guess you could say, there are plenty of examples, I guess, of companies doing something like that, even within tech. I would say Microsoft is a pretty good example. Very little of its revenue comes from Windows licenses anymore. But what I had in mind was a transformation like that actually succeeded in slowing down for a long time or stopping the disruption which triggered it in the first place.
I see. Oh, that's very different. Okay, yeah.
And I can't think of any off the top of my head. Maybe that's because it's hard to perceive things that didn't happen. But there's a long-running conspiracy theory about normal car companies buying up promising EV tech and just burying it, right? I don't know if that ever was true. That's...
Yeah, there.
How is that not?
That may be... Sure, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you switch from cars to Facebook, I don't think it's a conspiracy theory. No, sorry, not just to Facebook, but big companies that used to be startups buying new startups.
Right.
It seems like they get buried because they don't end up... They're effectively killed. So I used to have an email client that I was really happy with called Sparrow or something like that.
Oh, yeah, right.
And then suddenly it was bought by Gmail and just gone. And Gmail is still awful. So that was, I don't know, there might be examples like this where a disruption is killed, and maybe it's a little bit less speculative than in the auto industry.
Right, yeah. That's right, but I guess I'm actually deviating from my earlier... if it's co-opting, then just burying it is not really co-opting it. Well, it's maybe in a sense co-opting it, but it's more akin to just killing it and being successful.
Yeah.
So I don't exactly know what I'm even getting at, but it does seem like there might be a way of seeming to go along with the disruption, and through incumbent status being able to shape it, and through shaping it actually arrange for it to die. There must be examples like that. I think the nuclear industry is probably a good example. If you read the history of how the regulation worked in California, the fossil fuel lobbies directly arranged for... they funded environmental groups, or I think that's not a conspiracy theory. I think there's evidence of that. They, through various means, funded environmental groups and gave them help to raise specific objections to, was it Diablo Canyon or the other ones in California, and succeeded in making the regulations so onerous that that these plants, well, I forget the exact story, but I do think that it was a clear effort by the fossil fuel industry through lobbying organizations which the nuclear power plants had to belong to, through membership in those bodies, somehow shaped the outcome of that potentially disruptive technology. Maybe that's an example. And it does seem like if a new challenger, that mechanism for regulation does seem like must be a standard thing to try, right? You've got a new challenger. Okay, cryptocurrency. Okay, take distributed finance, right? So the banks don't have to defeat on their merits some neobank, which is based on a blockchain. They just have to make the very sane argument that, well, these things should be regulated by like banks, and they should join our industry organizations. And the Commonwealth Bank in Australia allows you to transfer cryptocurrency in its app, or you was trialing that. I don't know whether that's because they actually want people to use cryptocurrency, or whether they want to be able to tell the government, we're the experts on cryptocurrency. When you're writing your regulation, you should take this guy and this guy from our Berry cryptocurrency task force and put them on your government panel. I'm pretty sure that's kind of the purpose of putting cryptocurrency into their app. Maybe that's cynical, but being able to represent your company as kind of on the cutting edge in the new tech, and thereby getting your people onto the regulation panels because you know how to schmooze with the politicians and you're already lobbying them. That's, I guess, what I mean by co-opting.
Sorry, I'm just typing. I think that's a great point. There are, there must be examples, many examples in the past, certainly ones in the present, and maybe examples that aren't just technological. I mean, we could imagine this general strategy of feigning support in order to gain positional advantage. And then once positional advantage has been obtained, to then work either explicitly or implicitly, or maybe both at different stages, to actually undermine the either the forces of change that are at work, or the change, or to undermine the whatever changed in itself from occurring. And one could imagine that this would be an effective way for politicking, right, to prevent social transformations, to prevent, to forestall revolutions. One could imagine this in industries. It's sort of a competitive strategy. I think that there's probably some game theoretics about that, like pretending to be an ally or even a leader, and then switching, and having true motives or allegiance is hidden at first, and then only becomes apparent afterwards. I think this is almost certainly part of the general playbook, right? And there may be some, maybe there are certain conditions that enable this or allow this to occur. I think it's particularly relevant in that context. You need to have deep pockets. So the deeper pockets that you have, the longer you can finance sort of what's the right word? Sort of a campaign like that, or a feint, or some strategy of deception like that. You probably have to be quite, have quite a bit of capital that you can sort of sink into that. I would imagine it would be a fairly costly venture, but it's got it. I mean, I can't think of specific examples off the top of my head, but that just feels like a very familiar pattern or formula, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even in individual relationships, like among person to person, this is a familiar pattern. If you want to really undermine a person, or prevent some social change or something like that, some relationship change or something, you can pretend to be on someone's side for a while, or you can pretend to embrace the things that they embrace, and then you can sort of quietly work against that in a covert way until you've gotten far enough, secured enough of an advantage that you can then become overt about it. But that's a very familiar pattern, and so that must be part of the general strategy for responding to disruption. So, the threat of a technological adversary, as it were, right?
Yeah. I guess actually IBM's a good example of that. I mean, probably they've tried to co-opt every disruption in the last 50 years and failed, but they had or still have some money, so they can afford to set up a lab on X, Y, and Z.
Right.
I guess they're not necessarily trying to bury it. It doesn't seem to me like Watson or their quantum computing efforts are actually like secret attempts to bury those technologies. So maybe it's not a good example, but the mechanism of we have a bunch of cash, but we're no longer able to really do anything useful. So, but at least we can, hire people and sit them somewhere and seem to be involved in disruptive things. That's definitely going on everywhere.
Yeah, for sure. I guess it brings up a point here. Maybe this is worth considering, Dan. But there's sort of deliberate resistance. Resistance has a valency to it, right? It carries this connotation of conscious intent. Like, I'm going to resist this change. But it could be that there could be unintentional resistance to disruption, things that are not, that no individuals are conscious of, and that are just driven purely by unthinking dynamics. And then there could be things that are sort of purely accidental, or just more like quirks or bugs in a particular situation, as opposed to sort of consistent features that are in the dynamics across lots and lots of different cases. So I'll give you a specific example that comes to mind is what you said about SpaceX, right? Maybe NASA and the sort of quasi-military industrial space technology complex that's, or I guess it's not quasi, but it's actually military industrial, for rocketry, of course. Maybe the stifling of disruption there by sort of locking in the talent and supporting just a duopoly or a small contingent of big aerospace contractors that lost their hunger to innovate long ago. Maybe that was never really conscious or intentional. It's just right. A dynamic that emerges because in other words, it could be just more of an accidental outcome as opposed to a malicious, deliberately resistive response to perceived threats. And it may well be that you could have elements within these companies that really do want to, they really do want to self-disrupt. Right? You could have a whole bunch of engineers inside a company, and all of them are in sort of a Dilbert, dystopian sort of scenario where they just desperately wish they had a different culture there, but they're, for whatever reason, the company can't get it together, and but no, it's not really anybody's fault. You know what I mean? Do you see what I mean by that? Sure, it's not it's a conspiracy per se, conscious. It's just this, circumstance that emerges as the complexity. Gears kind of grind to a halt and lock in and seize up and lock in. Maybe talented people. Not through anybody's fault, even.
Yeah, maybe it's actually the framing is a little bit wrong. Maybe disruptions are self-derailing by default. So, in a sense, right? So maybe since since it's new, like you need a steady supply of clever, original people to keep a thing going, right? I mean, and those people are relatively rare, and even more rare are the people who can manage them and not wreck everything. So it's kind of like you imagine a board game where you've got 5 or 6 super managers who can actually manage such people and get something done, but you can only put them in 5 or 6 places, but you've got 100 things you could do, and maybe there's a disruption available in all of them, but you can only put those people in 5 or 6, and the other ones will just succumb to entropy and bureaucracy and bad management and careerism and just fade into nothing. So it's more like, maybe it's wrong to think about it as like people maliciously going out to co-opt disruptions or something. That's like standard human stupidity. That'll just happen on its own. And it's more that, kind of a miracle that you can collect enough people of that kind together for long enough to get something past the S-curve.
I think that's a really, really interesting insight. I bet there's a healthy dose of truth to that, for sure. And it may be that, going back to what I said earlier, you could have a cultural context, an entire underlying cultural background, set of values and norms and so forth that just create an overall atmosphere that quenches disruption by default. And one could imagine that most of the space of possible say governance structures, architectures are basically like that, and it's only perhaps a rarefied handful that succeed in creating conditions that run against that, what you said, that against that entropy, as it were, right? That actually foster disruption and give it the oxygen it needs. I'm mixing metaphors all over, but anyway, you know what I mean. That actually support it rather than stifle it. And so you again, there are probably things happening at different levels of analysis. We could imagine that maybe you have sort of the entire context default is one of oppression and stifling and limitation and just all of the things that we've mentioned that contribute to that, and that you only perhaps have rare windows that open up in which disruptions can really disruptions even really possible. And maybe they open up periodically for not for technological reasons, but for perhaps for social and political and cultural reasons as well. It could be that the folks who say that to be careful of technological determinism, there's these other factors that really provide all the other important enabling conditions that that could really be valid. For example, you might think, well, maybe if you look back at different civilizations' golden ages throughout history, maybe they part of what made those things golden age is that something about the architecture or the way the system in general was organized tipped out of the usual basin and allowed disruption to occur for different reasons, and then the golden age ends and tips back into the default, and you're stuck. You're much more stifled. You've got status quo is defended much more than change is encouraged, kind of thing. And it's easy, I think, to imagine that may be the case. We'll have to think pretty carefully about that. I will definitely take that idea to the team and see what, if we look through the historical cases that we've got and the different, especially the ones that predate the Industrial Revolution and are outside of Western civilization. I think we may find that is really, really a powerful insight, for sure. And then, of course, that carries over to this unit of analysis within an industry, for example, or some smaller unit than at the national scale.
Here's a question I've written on the board behind you. I guess my question, in a sense, is a little naive, because you only call it a disruption if it maybe you could say disruptions are being born every 5 minutes and most of them die, but you kind of only call it a disruption if it succeeds and survives up until the point it stabilizes at a large market share or something. And those other
Right.
Yeah.
Brad and I have been we've been calling this the survivorship bias.
Right. So I wonder what the distribution of aborted disruptions looks like. Like what are, I mean, I guess that you don't remember them historically, but like where are these in the records? And I mean, you can't probably really understand disruption unless you understand it in the context of, I mean, it's part of a distribution, right? And maybe you can't actually understand disruption unless you study the whole distribution.
Yep.
I guess that's hard.
Now, one thing that we might do here is we may, in order to kind of cheat around this problem, we could define disruption as those cases of success only, and we could say, maybe what you were calling, an aborted disruption maybe there was some criteria that meant that they could not, at least maybe in advance, couldn't in principle have been disruptions. And I do wonder if that's if that would be a way to cheat around the problem, or whether or in other words, sometimes you can narrow the scope of what you're focusing on with definitions, and then it is a little bit of a cheating, but it just keeps things manageable. And I'm wondering if, because the thing with this is that you would then open up a big kettle of fish to every potential form of change that humanity experienced, not just technological, but social and political and cultural and everything.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
And all of the different patterns of change that exist. And all of them, or not all of them, but I mean, perhaps many of those could, at some stage have potentially, become disruptions, and then some might not. And so, anyway, I see a scope creep here that intimidates me. But having said that, it's very difficult to argue with. We need to see examples of these sorts of patterns that you've drawn up here, and we're not see them, but we need to look at them, and if we find them, we need to understand them, because otherwise we are just guilty of, as I said, what Brad and I have been calling survivorship bias, which is we're only looking at the cases that followed the pattern that we were looking for, and that's you can really fool yourself pretty badly that way. So
yeah, I think that's right with scope creep. On the other hand, it does suggest it's pretty hard to really understand derailing disruption, because that's fundamentally about moving it from one category to the other on this diagram, right?
It may be that the derailing is, and I don't know, maybe there just aren't very many examples of this. It's possible that we're imagining a phenomenon that's rare enough that it doesn't completely undermine the rest of the sort of the inquiry. But one thing that I'm also interested in addition to derailing, is the delaying, slowing it down, like stretching the S-curve out over time. I guess one thing maybe perhaps also is containing it, like limiting where the or what would be the right way to say that, constraining this, lowering the ceiling, like lowering the upper bound of the upper limit that the S-curve approaches. I don't know if that's a thing. Maybe I don't know if that's occurred, if it can occur, if it has occurred in the past. I would imagine that S-curves could be shortened or lengthened in time. They could be compressed, as it were, along the x-axis if time is on the x-axis, because we see shorter and longer examples of the same disruption in different places, in different countries, right? We see early adoption in some countries and later adoption elsewhere. So we already see that is possible. That sort of resisting disruption that causes that change. But I don't know if I'm trying to think of examples where a disruption was properly derailed, and GMOs are about as good of an example as I can think of,
Right.
where that really had potential, and then it was halted by firm regulation.
I guess we're
Maybe some examples of pharmaceuticals, like maybe marijuana, for example, had the potential to be a disruptive, an entire class of drugs that were disruptive, and antidepressants and anxiety and all this thing, and then we just botched that entire thing with this social.
Clearly psychedelics.
Yeah, psychedelics. Yeah, exactly. Those as well. So maybe that's another good example. Yeah, right there.
I guess we're coming up on the end of the time, but before we do, I want to let's come down here. I'll show you something while we wrap up our discussion. So you're imagining that half the subscribers to Rethink X's reports are trying to derail disruptions, and the other half are trying to encourage them.
Yeah, I don't know what the ratio is, but it's good to find out. I think a lot of people pay